So good evening and welcome to Slooh. This is Constellation Stories and I'm Helen Avery, the human spirit correspondent for Slooh. And I'll be here for the next hour talking all tales and legends about the constellation Taurus. So just wanted to give you a heads up of where we are right now. Hopefully you can get a good look at through the Chile telescope. We've got some storms in the Canary Islands tonight, so we're hoping to bring you, let me just turn that off, just getting feedback. So yeah, hopefully you will be able to see a bunch of stuff over the next hour that's all in the constellation Taurus. So we will have the Hyades, we're going to be having Aldebaran, the star, the Eye of the Bull, the Pleiades, and the Crab Nebula. And all of this is coming from our Chile telescope. And it's a couple of new missions. The Chile telescope hasn't been on a mission to the Hyades or Aldebaran, so we'll see how that goes. I'm just going to click over to the telescopes right now and just see what we can see on the Chile wide field. Here we go. Here's the Hyades. Okay, so we're there. Right, great. Okay. So I'll try and keep an eye on Facebook as well if you have any questions and want to post them. And just to let you know that the audio is on in the Space Situation Room, but as of next week, we're going to have audio across the site. So you'll be able to jump around the telescopes and still have audio, so you can sort of hop on the Chile wide field and read under it and swap to the All Sky Cam. And stuff like that. So that's all great. Okay, so I'm just going to zoom back to the Space Situation Room and see where we are. And hopefully you can see what I can see. Let's have a look. Okay, we'll just got audio only right now. So you're not seeing the Chile cam there. Okay, so Taurus. It's one of the reasons we're looking at Taurus right now is because if you're in the Northern Hemisphere, Taurus is a great constellation to go and see right now. It's up there from like November, December and January. But particularly right now, it's looking great. And you can see the Pleiades and the Hyades, and you can see Aldebaran. And the way that we find it is typically you're just looking for Orion's belt. And then the uppermost star on the right of Orion's belt, following that line up, you'll get to a red sort of glowing, orangey glowing star, and that's Aldebaran, and that's the Eye of Taurus, our bull. So it's really easy to find because, typically we know our way around the sky through Orion's belt and the Big Dipper. That's another one that's pretty easy to find. So Taurus is a great one to be able to sort of go out in the backyard and have a good look at. And the Hyades, which hopefully you'll be able to see in the Space Situation Room, not seeing it right now. Oh, the Chile wide field. I'm sorry. If you click on the Chile wide field in the Space Situation Room, you'll be looking into the Hyades. And it's going to look a bit of a mess. And that's actually a star cluster. It's an open star cluster of the Hyades. And the way it appears in the sky is it looks like a V. And Aldebaran is like the eye on the top left of this V shape, and it looks like what would appear to be the bull's head. But the Hyades has nothing to do with Aldebaran. In fact, they just look like they're close together, but they're not. And the Hyades is about 165 light years away, maybe 150 light years away. Now Aldebaran's only 65. So it's entirely different. But anyway, we're going to be talking, as I say, about our bull and some of the myths and legends from the bull, why the sacred bull has been so important to humanity for as long as we know about the beginning of humanity. And it's possible that Taurus is maybe one of the oldest constellations, if not the oldest constellation. It can be found, for example, in the Lascaux caves. So some of these prehistoric cave paintings and also the Paleta caves in southern Spain. I was lucky enough to go there last year, and you'll often see in these prehistoric paintings of bulls, and typically they'll look like different sizes. In the Lascaux cave paintings, which they think are about 17,000 years old, and the Piletta cave paintings are about 30,000 years old, you'll see paintings of like a brownish bull, we typically associate with a bull, and then a much larger black and white bull. And in the Lascaux cave paintings, you can even see some sort of like dots in the forehead that some people have suggested indicates the Hyades. And then above the shoulder of the bull, there are 6 dots, which indicate the Pleiades. Now, we typically know the Pleiades as 7 sisters, but throughout antiquity, they have been known as 6 or 7. So it's possible that this could be one of the earliest representations that exists for us to look at of the constellation Taurus, that perhaps, whether it was for like ritualistic reasons or for art's sake, who knows, probably we think more likely to be ritual, that there was this depiction of the stars that brought in the Pleiades and this bull-type animal that was black and white and much larger than the brownish bull that was also in these paintings. And that is because this animal was not a bull, it was actually an aurochs. So it turns out that all this time we've been thinking that maybe Taurus is a bull up in the sky. It's actually something called an aurochs. So the aurochs was sort of a member of the megafauna. So, you know, those really huge mammals like woolly mammoths who were there during the Ice Age. And there's actually been fossils found in India that date back 2 million years ago, but it could well have been there before that, and maybe even predated early humans. We just don't know. But this aurochs was said to be sort of, you know, prolific throughout. With, you know, as I mentioned, in India, there's remains in Western Europe, there are remains in throughout Asia and Siberia. So, you know, we tend to think because of the paintings and some of the remains that we found that this aurochs, this enormous aurochs, this bull, was incredibly important and there from when we sort of started to become as we are today. So I wanted to read to you a little bit about the aurochs. So, as I mentioned, you know, they're sort of around millions of years ago, but they actually didn't die out until 1627, when the very last aurochs known to exist was in a forest in Poland, and she died of natural causes. So it's just so interesting to think that this aurochs was around for such a long time with humanity, although we wouldn't even know about it. So I have this great book called Traveller's Tales, a Book of Marvels by Henry Cadwallader Adams, and it was written in the 1800s. And he basically went through a lot of research and asked people who'd travelled around to far-flung places at those times the things that they'd seen. And he collected, lots of stories and put them into these books. And one part of it is looking at sort of these mythical creatures, or these creatures that were said to exist around the world. And there's this wonderful sort of description about what the aurochs looked like. Okay. So he says, another monstrous beast, and we don't know if it was monstrous or not, but that actually did exist and maybe still does. So in the 1800s, there were still rumours of the odd aurochs being seen in a forest. And even a couple of years ago, I heard of someone who said they came across something very weird in a forest in Poland that had fiery red eyes and scared the bejesus out of them and had horns. So who knows? Maybe there is still an aurochs. But he goes on to say that that Caesar mentions an aurochs in some of his accounts and said that they were just a little bit smaller than an elephant. If you can imagine this enormous bull, nothing like the bulls we see today, but actually the size of an elephant. And in in appearance seem to be like bulls, said Caesar. Their strength and swiftness of foot is great, and they show no mercy to any man. The inhabitants of Germany, or Germania at that time, is saying, put them in pits and kill them. They cannot possibly be tamed, said Caesar, which actually isn't true, because about 9,000 years ago they began to be domesticated. But the most interesting, most descriptive piece I've seen about the aurochs is in a novel. So there's an Irish gentleman called Mr. Grattan who used to write these historical novels, and he didn't get much praise for his work, and some people said he wasn't always very accurate. But in one of his novels called Jacqueline of Holland, he writes, "The horses and dogs, every one of them startled and trembled in the instinct of brute alarm. The very deer that lay on the ground in the last gasp of death made a struggling effort to rise and expired with a shudder of fear. The next moment a roar of terrible depth resounded through the forest, and the monster which had sent it forth appeared close to the group, crashing through branch and briar with an air of savage majesty at once appalling and sublime. His height and bulk were enormous, double that of an ordinary-sized bull. He was jet black, with the exception of a broad stripe of white running along his back, as was visible when he stooped his huge head to the earth, butting against it and tearing it up furiously with his short, thick horns, while his eyes gleamed like fireballs under the tuft of hair curling garland-like on his front, and he lashed his long tail and shook his mane that hung full 6 feet from his neck and swept the ground." So I just love this description because it really starts to give us an idea of what the aurochs was. That was the first depiction of that constellation that we know as Taurus. And indeed, it sort of lines up with some of the cave paintings. They were black and white, the bulls, the enormous bulls that were in the cave paintings, as described here by Mr. Grattan. And I love this eyes gleam like fireballs, because when we think about Aldebaran up there, the eye of our aurochs, as we know it to be now, it's sort of that reddy orange because it's a red giant, which would match perfectly with sort of this depiction of an aurochs. So I thought that was just fascinating that all this time we've been thinking of Taurus as the bull, when actually it's this creature called an aurochs that doesn't exist today, but we get to look up at the sky and see it. And in fact, there in Europe, there's something called rewilding Europe, but it's happening in North America too, where people are trying to bring back species that have died out by taking sort of breeds that have sort of similar DNA strands and reworking it. So some scientists or biologists are working with ancient cattle in Europe to try and see if they can recreate the aurochs, although most likely it will be a much smaller version, because what happened to the aurochs was that, as I mentioned, 9,000 years ago, they began to be domesticated and probably probably bred with regular cattle. So they became smaller and smaller, and eventually, throughout, they still existed throughout the hundreds, and as we know, sort of into one left in the 1600s. But they were hunted so massively and because of the sort of breeding out of them, that's why they in the end became extinct. And I say we get to see them up in the constellations. So if you're looking at the Chile wide field, you will be now looking at Aldebaran. So this is the eye of our aurochs. It's not looking particularly fiery and red right here. It's looking beautiful and white, but that is Aldebaran, and it sort of appears, as I mentioned, in the face of the bull. It's the eye of the bull, and it looks like it's part of the Hyades star cluster, but it's not, in fact. Okay, so I'm just going to take a moment just to flip on Facebook and see if anyone has posted any questions. maybe give you a chance to mess around with the wide field camera. Maybe check out the all sky camera. Okay, how are we doing? Look. Yeah, I'd love to hear where you are this evening. If you are able to go outside and look up at Taurus, maybe you're a Taurus. I'm a Taurus. I know Mike, Slooh CEO, founder, is a Taurus. So sorry, just bear with me a second while I load up and see if we have any questions. And hopefully we're going to be adding the possibility for call-ins. So in future, I might be able to take some calls, and people, you can call in and tell me where you're looking up, and whether you're a Taurus or whatever constellation we're looking at. Okay, here we go. We've got someone from Wisconsin. Someone's watching a football game. So not outside watching the door, looking at the skies, but inside, keeping an eye on us. We're here at Slooh, so that's great. Okay. So the bull has been sacred throughout history. You know, as we mentioned, obviously there's some connection to early humans. That's why they were painted in caves and maybe sort of mirrored in the stars. People looked up in the stars and saw the aurochs, because the aurochs was such a familiar sight to them down on the ground. But it, you know, if we're talking sort of 30,000 years ago, it's actually in recorded history that we really begin to see the importance of the aurochs. I'm just going to keep saying aurochs. You can say bull if you want, but I'm just going to keep saying aurochs. You can begin to see the importance of it. So, you know, if you start to think about recorded history, comes in about 6,000 odd years ago. What's really fascinating for me is that around 6,000 years ago, the vernal equinox would have occurred in Taurus. Oh, great! Now we're getting a bit of sort of red in Aldebaran, if you're looking at the star here. Yeah, so the age of Taurus, that's so when the vernal equinox is in a zodiac sign, it's what we call the age of, and then the zodiac sign. So 4,300 BC to about 2,000 BC was known as the age of Taurus, because the vernal equinox happened in Taurus. And there's all sorts of wonderful things you can read up about this, you know, like there's lots of people who say that depending on what that age, that constellation is, will govern a lot of the things that are happening on Earth. So interestingly, around this time, the bull was seen as extremely sacred across the world. And we're going to talk a bit more about some of the things that we've sort of discovered about how important the bull was to people around the world. But also, it's sort of, people say that this age reflects what's happening on Earth in terms of, at this time, agriculture was really beginning to take off. And the bull and the cattle were a massive part of that. You know, using the plows. There's wonderful pictures, images from ancient Egypt of ancient Egyptians with this huge black and white bull or cattle or aurochs in front of them, sort of helping them plow. And you can imagine, if it's the size of an elephant, how important that animal would have been in helping you do your work. And then, of course, cattle was used for, you know, leather and food and milk. Yeah, this age of Taurus, which really is just that the equinox would have occurred in Taurus. As I say, it's 4,000 odd BC, ending about 2,000 BC. And that's really the time of a lot of the earliest recorded history we have. So you have, and what we have around that time is like the Egyptians. For the Egyptians, Apis was the sacred bull worshipped there. You know, and they were sort of 3,000 BC down to about 600 BC, the ancient Egyptians. That, again, would have been in this age of Taurus. So a lot of the stuff we see from ancient Egyptians has this this iconography of the bull. And Apis was the sacred bull. It was said to be the god and son of Hathor. So possibly even the first Egyptian god ever was a bull, or a bull man. And Hathor, Hathor has been named, has been said by some to have meant Pleiades. But Hathor was seen as the goddess of the sky and fertility. She was like the mother, and her son, this first god, was a bull. So she was like this heavenly cow. And around this time, of course, the pyramids are being built, and there's a lot of research or conjecture about archaeoastronomy and whether the pyramids were built to line up with Aldebaran, perhaps, or the Pleiades. And because of this importance of Taurus, because, maybe I skipped over this point, but the vernal equinox is like this period of rebirth. It's spring. It's when everything starts to become lush and things start to grow, and you get to have food again, and the rains come. So, that's why it would have been such an important time, and to have sort of the bull be part of that sort of change in the season kind of maybe explains why the bull became such a sacred animal, or, why this star sign maybe reflected what was going on Earth. We can just sort of imagine all these wonderful things. So this is happening in Egypt. Meanwhile, in Iran, Zoroastrianism, so that's around 2000 BC, tons of references to this giant sacred bull who straddles the mountains and seas and carries men on his back. Then in Babylon, we've got Marduk, was god to the Mesopotamians and then the Babylonians, and he was a bull calf to the sun, this Marduk. And in fact, on the Ishtar gates, which are the inner gates of the city of Babylon, you'll see a picture of an aurochs, and there it's actually white, a pure white. So you can imagine if you found like an albino aurochs, just how sacred that would have been. Then you have the Minoans, 2600 BC to about 1100 BC. They're on Crete before the ancient Greeks. And they sort of are known for all sorts of bull festivals, bull leaping, all these images of people leaping over bulls in the palace of Knossos that was uncovered there, and several sort of icons with bull horns, and then of course there's a whole myth that emerged after them from the ancient Greeks about the Minoans having a minotaur, which was part man, part bull. So again, this sort of real influence of the bull over this whole age of Taurus. It's so interesting, although we've seen that, way back thousands and thousands, tens of thousands of years before that, the bull was still seen as this sort of mythical and very real, but sort of more mystical and spiritual, sacred animal. So I thought I'd share with you, as we're sort of pausing around ancient Greece, just a couple of the myths about Taurus, the constellation, which is, if you're joining us now, which is what we're looking at tonight. Right now, we're looking at Aldebaran through the Chile Wide Field Telescope, because Canary is stormed out this evening. And Aldebaran is the eye of the bull. It's a red giant. So the ancient Greeks, one of the myths goes that in order to seduce a beautiful princess named Europa, Zeus, it's always Zeus, he's such Zeus transforms himself into a snow white bull and carries her off on his back to the island of Crete. So no mistake there that, no coincidence that within the ancient Greek myths, they're talking about Crete. Again, the Minoans sort of were wiped out, possibly by several earthquakes, tsunamis, volcanoes that potentially happened, but also maybe just, climate change or trade change, something like that. But the ancient Greeks came after them and obviously carried some of those myths with them. And they had this beautiful one. So Zeus becomes a bull and carries off Europa to this island of Crete. And there Europa gives birth to the sun, who later becomes Minos, the king of Crete. But he's really cruel. And so Venus steps in to make Minos' wife fall in love with a bull. And then she gives birth to this half-human, half-bull known as the Minotaur, who unfortunately is this monster and has to be contained within a labyrinth and then fed from the sacrifice of 14 virgins, if that's not enough. But there has sort of been an uncovering of a labyrinth in Crete that dates back to that period. So a lot of these beautiful myths would have come from, from something, from some sort of stories that have been passed down orally, whether or not there was a Minotaur, we don't know, but but there certainly would have been stories that would have really captured people's imagination back then. To us, maybe today, we're like, well, that's bizarre, but back then, given the sacredness of the bull and the closeness and the proximity of Crete, it would have made sense. Then, of course, we have going on around the same time the mention in the Bible of the golden calf. So I'm not too familiar with the Bible, so I was reading up on it earlier, but some people say it might have been written about 500 BC. The Exodus, this is, I know it's a series of books that were written over a different period, but Exodus they think was written about 500 BC. And in Exodus, there's a story of Moses, who goes up the mountain to get the Ten Commandments, and the sort of Israelites, he's gone so long that the Israelites start to think that he's abandoned them. And then Aaron suggests that they melt all their gold that they have and build this golden calf. And then Moses comes down and sees them worshipping this false god. And God's very displeased, and it goes on from there. But some people sort of have interpreted this as it being representative of this shifting from these pagan rituals that would have been present of worshipping the bull and all these beautiful sacred bulls that have been passed down in that area of the world, sort of turning to become this sort of one god movement that resulted in Judeo-Christian Islamic religion. But again, sort of interesting that even in the Bible, there's this idea that that we can see that there was the bull was worshipped in that period of the world. And then moving on, we have the Romans, and then wonderful. If you know anything about Mithraism, was this Roman cult of where Mithras was like a warrior who killed the bull, who slayed the bull, and Mithraeums were like temples where there would be tauroctony, it's called. It's like wall art of bulls, and then Mithras sort of slaying or hunting for these bulls, and there would have been sacrificial events with bulls, and some people say it was actually a metaphor. It was nothing to do with a particular a person or even on a story, that it was about the end of the age of Taurus, that this Mithras was like Ares, the warrior, killing the bull, which I find fascinating because the age of Taurus, as we talked about, ended in the year 2000, and then the age of Aries was 2000 to 0. And then, of course, the age of Pisces, which is very interesting given the symbolism of the fish in Christianity. So interesting why the Romans, in the sort of like 0 AD, 1 AD, would have brought back this idea of the slaying of the bull. Just a real juiciness, and it's such a mystery cult. People really don't understand it. There's not much written about it. If you ever get the chance to go to New Haven in Connecticut at the Yale Art Gallery, which is free to the public, they have a Mithraeum there, and it's unbelievable. It's so beautiful, and you can see all the imagery of the zodiac around this small like cave temple. So again, sorry, back to our point that Taurus, this sacred bull, is important throughout history, and even all the way up to the Romans. And then as we get into sort of the early years of this millennia, the last millennia, sorry, we start to find stories about bulls moving through Western Europe into sort of Celtic traditions. So I just wanted to read something to you from antiquity that talks about the Druids and their rituals around the bull. So it says this was in Gaul around the 1st century first year AD. The Druids, that's what they call their magicians, hold nothing more sacred than the mistletoe and a tree on which it's growing, provided it is Valonia oak. Mistletoe is rare, and when it's found, it's gathered with great ceremony, particularly on the 6th day of a moon. Hailing the moon in a native word that means healing all things, they prepare a ritual sacrifice and banquet beneath a tree and bring up 2 white bulls, whose horns are bound for the first time on this occasion. A priest, arrayed in white vestments, climbs the tree with a golden sickle, cuts down the mistletoe, which is caught in a white cloak, and then the bulls are killed. And prayers are sent to God to render his gift fortunate to those whom it's bestowed it. And they believe that the mistletoe given in a drink will give fertility to any animal that's barren. And that's, I find this so fascinating. And particularly, I don't know if you know this, but this particular moon coming up, our supermoon on December the 3rd, is also known as the oak moon. And now is the time to collect mistletoe. That's why we have mistletoe at Christmas. So the Druids who were sacrificing the bulls and out collecting the mistletoe on this particular day of the moon, it would have been happening around this season when they could have looked up and seen in the sky Taurus the bull and the Pleiades and Aldebaran staring back at them. And I've just noticed we have a shift in our telescope. So, let's have a look what we're looking at. Yes, it's the Pleiades, although here it's sort of hard to figure out which of the 7 sisters we're looking at. But now I think we are focused on the Pleiades, which is still in the constellation Taurus, sort of on the shoulder of the bull. And there's another Irish legend that comes to us from the beloved Burnham Celestial Handbook that I wanted to read to you. And it says, so some 25 miles northwest of Dublin stands the revered hilltop of Tara. If you've ever heard those old Irish folk songs about Tara, you might recognise this. And it was the site of a stronghold of the High Kings of ancient Ireland. And there was held the Bull Feast of legend, during which the name of the destined next king was revealed by a mysterious rite called the Imbras Feroznai. No idea if I said that right. But it means the knowledge which illuminates. And in the tiny churchyard at Tara may still be seen the curious adamant stone, a carved pillar some 5 feet high, upon which is engraved the enigmatic figure of a horned god. And it's thought to have been an important deity to the ancient Celts. So very interesting then, this sort of idea of the sacred bull. Maybe it started with the aurochs, and then sort of developed into this sort of myth of half man, half bull that we see in the Minotaur, and then that moves into this sort of pagan and Celtic sort of god that again is maybe a man with horns. And then very interesting to think how the Bible, which had been very keen to get rid of paganism, depicts the devil with horns. I thought that was very interesting. Maybe something in that. But then even away from Western Europe, all the way over in India, we have the sacred bull. And as I mentioned earlier, the aurochs fossils, the earliest fossils that have been found of the aurochs were found in India, and they dated back to 2 million years ago. But for Hindus, the sacred bull is Nandi. That's the name of it. And Nandi carries Shiva. And Shiva is like the god of all gods, the Lord God Destroyer. And Nandi carries Shiva on his back. And Nandi is, in fact, a god in its own right. There are shrines to Nandi. And again, they sort of are worshipped for a lot by women. They're worshipped for fertility. Again, sort of tying into that idea of spring, of Taurus being in the Vernal Equinox and being a signal of, things becoming fertile again. So it all sort of kind of ties in together. I'm just taking a look at the scope again. that's on the Pleiades, and we're really beginning to see some of that blueness, that beautiful blue that we get with the Pleiades. I love it. So there are many, many shrines, as I mentioned, in India. People visit them to offer flowers and ask for fertility and enlightenment. And that's because Nandi, and I just love this, Nandi the bull in India is seen more than just this bull that carries Shiva, but it's believed by some that Nandi is this guru that lies within us all, sort of representative of us carrying our own Shiva god nature on our back. And this ties in perfectly to the Pleiades, which is where we are now. So this whole idea of the bull carrying something very special, this bull in the sky, has been seen in a couple of stories. So one of the stories is that, I mentioned that to find Taurus, we start with Orion's belt often. And one of the Greek myths is that the seven sisters, the Pleiades, which are on the other side of Aldebaran, are being protected by this bull and keeping Orion at bay, because the Pleiades are something very, very special. And if you look on the cave paintings in Lascaux, as I mentioned earlier, and I put them on the site in Illuminations, this particular picture, the Pleiades are kind of on the shoulder, almost on the back of this bull. So you begin to think, well, what does this mean? That there's something about this bull that's the stories that have come through time about the bull carrying something, protecting something important from this Orion hunter type, who was seen as Zeus again by the Greeks, but has been seen as an evil man or an aggressive warrior. I know the Aborigines believe that the Pleiades are a collection of seven sisters who sort of are trying to run away from this sort of this man, this aggressor. But sort of tying back into this idea of Nandi sort of carrying, the Hindu idea that Nandi carries this something very sacred, this sort of god or Shiva nature or god nature on its back. Native Americans used to believe, or I don't, maybe they still do, not all peoples, but that the Pleiades is the center of the universe. And this was echoed by the Mayans and the Aztecs, and a lot of sort of South American peoples as well, that the Pleiades is incredibly special. And there's all sorts of things you can read about whether the Pleiades, people who believe people from the Pleiades came and populated Earth, or maybe the Pleiades was an Earth before Earth was Earth, that kind of thing. Somewhere in the Pleiades there was a planet that was similar to Earth once. I don't know, but there is this sort of sense among certainly indigenous people that we can sort of talk to now, that the Pleiades hold something sort of very sacred to humankind. What you want to make of that is up to you, but it sort of ties in with this idea of being on the bull's back and protected from this sort of aggressor Orion or this sort of other figure. So I just thought that was absolutely fascinating. And you'll see also, around the world, and we talked about this last week about the midnight culmination in the Pleiades, these wonderful sites that were built so that you could go and see the Pleiades at midnight culmination, where the highest point they are in the year. There was something very magical or mystical, or a huge connection for humans with the Pleiades, and the Pleiades was within Taurus, and as we've talked about, there was this huge importance of the aurochs or the bull and its meaning for humans throughout time. So such a really, really juicy constellation. So much in it, and just a couple of things about the Pleiades. So it's 445 light years away. That's what we're looking at right now. That's baffling, and it's about 125 million years old. So these stars, so each one known as a Pleiad, they are like young adults. So in this stage of their life, they are spinning the fastest they ever will, and there's great information about that spinning on the NASA website if you get to have a look at it. So I can see the telescope's just going in and out for its 5-minute segment. Here we go again. Yeah, and they're traveling through a dust cloud, so it gives them a sort of nebulosity. And one of the stars in particular, and people argue over which one it is, whether it's Merope or Pleione, seem to sort of be hidden every now and again. And some people say that's why some people have said there are only 6 in the Pleiades and not 7, although actually we know there are more than 1,000 members of the Pleiades. Just more familiar to us, this particular 7. Okay, so I'm just gonna go and have a quick look on Facebook and see if anyone's asking anything. I'll leave you to wonder at the Pleiades for a moment. And there's so much written about the Pleiades. I'm hoping that we'll do something in more detail about the Pleiades, specifically for the regarding the Australian Aborigines. I was very lucky to spend time with an Aboriginal community a couple of years ago. My aunt used to work with a community in the middle of Australia, and I just loved the paintings of the Pleiades that the women there were doing, and I would go and say to them, "Oh, can you tell me the story of the Pleiades, of the 7 sisters?" And so, not everyone, all the women spoke English. A lot of them spoke what's called language, but they would start wailing, like all of them, just like rocking and wailing, and then they would say, "Oh, it was just so terrible. What happened to them? Just so terrible. What happened to the 7 sisters? And oh, just an awful story. The horrible man who got them." And it was so visceral. It was just as if they were reliving it, and that really came across in the artwork of the 7 sisters. And if you Google, 7 sisters Aboriginal artwork, you'll see it's just phenomenal. The richness of the story of the Pleiades is still to Aboriginal people in Australia. It's really amazing. There are different types of stories, but typically they're about these 7 women who end up running away into the sky, and they're forever running away from this aggressor. But yeah, so much to talk about when it comes to the Pleiades. So okay, I'm just scrolling down. Got someone from Germany, fantastic. And Wisconsin. And Jerry Horton, and he's also a Taurus. You're in good company. Although, not to drift away, but we will be doing Gemini next. And Gemini is another really juicy constellation. So much good stories about Gemini. Okay, but sticking to Taurus. So in about 3 minutes, we're going to be, hopefully, if everything works out, ending our time in Taurus with the Crab Nebula. So I just wanted to tell you a little bit about the Crab Nebula, because the Crab Nebula is up in the horn of Taurus the Bull, and has its own really juicy story. The wonderful thing is, and we'll be talking these constellation sky stories every Sunday here at 9, other than next week where it's the supermoon challenge. We'll talk a bit about that in a minute. But they're just so rich, and the more the reason that people shared stories about the constellation was to help them, remember them before things were written down, and we've kind of lost that a bit. So I think it's really beautiful to keep sharing these stories, and maybe sort of even start creating our own. I'd love to see new stories emerging about some of these patterns of stars in the skies. And once you start to share these stories, it just makes it so much easier when you're outside. When you look up, you go, "Oh yes, okay, there's Orion's belt," because you remember the story of Orion, and you remember that he's got this face-off with this bull protecting the Pleiades, and all of a sudden you can just find your way around the sky, which is very similar to what the Aborigines do in terms of the dream time and the art. Is their way of remembering the sky, but chiefly it's a way of remembering the land. So something very deep in that sort of part of humanity that we're losing touch with, forever just Google mapping everything and GPSing. So, and never committing to memory these deep, rich stories of our ancestors. So I'm thrilled that we're going to be talking about these every week. But the Crab Nebula, which we're about to pop to in about a minute. So I'm just going to read what Brian actually on in our illuminations on the website, which you may be able to scroll down and see, wrote about the Crab Nebula, because I just really love what he wrote and the way he wrote it. And he says, on a late April morning in the year 1054, sharp-eyed Chinese astronomers awakened to the spectacle of a blazing new star in the daytime sky. This guest star, as they called it, appeared out of nowhere, shone with a reddish-white light, some 6 times brighter than Venus. And here we can see Crab Nebula emerging and the chilly wide scope. Wonderful. So they wake up and they see this guest star that they haven't seen before. And it's like this reddish-white light, sometimes some 6 times brighter than Venus, that slowly faded from daytime view after 23 days. It stayed in the sky for 23 days. Can you imagine just sort of waking up, seeing this and thinking, oh my God, and then it just stays and stays. And what they saw, and what we're looking at now, or what they saw then, and now we're looking at the remains of, was a core collapse supernova. It's a massive star that suddenly falls in upon itself before exploding with as much energy as an entire galaxy. Just blows my mind. And so the Chinese, the Japanese, and their Arabic counterparts actually all mention this explosion, or this sort of new star they thought that was appearing, that later people figured out they were talking about the the Crab Nebula. And we're not really seeing the color right now, but if you get a chance this week to reserve Canary 3, maybe even Canary 2, to take a look at the Crab Nebula, I would do that, because you get to see some of the rich color that's there, and it's fantastic. Not that gave it, I was like, oh, I'm sure that's why it's called crab, because it's got this reddish orange tinge to it, but no, it's not at all. It's that the person who discovered it, well, it was obviously discovered before that, but someone in the 1800s drew it, what they'd seen, and it looked like a crab, their drawing, and so it was called the Crab Nebula, but that's the only reason. But this is the Crab Nebula, and as I mentioned, we are talking about Taurus if you've just joined us, and the Crab Nebula can be found within the constellation Taurus. So what we're looking at here, it's so amazing just to think we're looking at a nebula. This nebula spans 10 light years. So just in what we're looking at, you can imagine how many light years you are looking at right now in this wide field camp. It just blows my mind. It blows my mind. And at the center of this nebula, there's a pulsar, the Crab pulsar, and it's a neutron star as massive, with as much mass as our sun, but only the size of a small town. That powerful. So just phenomenal. Okay, so I think that's about it from me on Taurus this week. There really is so much we can talk about, and there's a few things you can poke around the website and have a look. Oh my God, and there we are, that redness is coming in, and I'm so glad we get to see that. That's wonderful. The Crab Nebula in all its red glory, nothing to do with the red in crabs. But yes, you can have a look around the website, and you'll see various, whether it's science or DIY or human spirit and arts and cultures, some postings that we've all put up about Taurus and the Pleiades and the Hyades and Aldebaran and the Crab Nebula. And as I say, it's a really good time to go outside and have a look for yourselves up at the sky. You might even be able to make out like a faint blur of the Crab Nebula, you never know. But you'll certainly be able to see the Pleiades, the Hyades, Aldebaran. So definitely pop out and take a look, and maybe collect some mistletoe while you're there, or try not to, probably not slaughter a bull, probably not. So as I say, or reserve a telescope this week so you can have a closer look, maybe really see some of that nebulosity of the Pleiades. Again, if you could reserve the Pleiades in Canary 3 or 2, and you'd be able to see some of that sort of shimmering shimmering light of the Pleiades that makes them so magical. So as I mentioned before, we're going to be here, or I'm going to be here every Sunday at 9 p.m. Picking a different constellation, one that you can see in the Northern Hemisphere, so you can actually get out and have a good look, but also one that we can sort of pick out some great things that we can see with our telescopes here at Slooh, and talking mainly about the sort of tales in our connection throughout history to these wonderful constellations, which really, are our maps of the sky at night. But next week, we have our Supermoon Challenge. So we're taking a break next week, but hopefully you'll be here for that. It is a supermoon, and here at Slooh, we're asking you to sort of join in all of our ancestors who would have, been outside at the full moon for various reasons, looking for healing or greater powers, or, again, fertility. That was always a big one. So we're asking you to sort of, join us in stepping outside and marking the occasion with, playing baseball or reciting a poem. And you can find out more about the Supermoon Challenge on our livecast page and on the homepage. So I hope you join us next week for that. And then the week after, I'll be back with constellation stories in our build-up to the holiday season. Where we'll be again sharing some tales. I'd love to hear from you. You can always email me at Helen@Slooh. You could put something on the forum if there's a constellation you wanted to talk about, or if you have any questions. As I mentioned, we are upping the ante on the audio. So next week you'll be able to listen to audio across the site, so you can poke around and read the illuminations and create your own posts if you wanted while we're talking. And also, hopefully down the line, we'll be maybe having some guests and the opportunity for you to call in and ask questions, or just share where you are as you're looking up, and whether you're looking at the constellations that we're looking at. So that's all from me. I'm going to leave you in silence just to sit and marvel at the Crab Nebula. I'm loving the way it comes in white and then slowly deepens as the 5-minute booking goes on into this sort of red. So enjoy. Wish you all a wonderful Sunday evening. And that's it from me until next time.